Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ryan Bijan, host of Cowtown Movie Classics. And if this is your first time tuning in, the goal of Cowtown Movie Classics is to make vintage Hollywood, old Hollywood classic films, or just vintage movies in general, available to our community with the proper historical context. So we like showing a lot of films that maybe people may not have heard about before. Of course, we love Casablanca, Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, but there's a lot of other great, interesting films out there. And one of the goals of our series is to raise awareness of other classic film related events in the Dallas Fort Worth area. And I was incredibly excited to learn that the Amon Carter Museum is hosting a series centered around Karl Struss, the amazing award winning cinematographer and still photographer. And Karl Struss is one of those luminaries from really the dawn of Hollywood filmmaking, especially in the 1930s pre-code era. If you know Cowtown Movie Classics, you know we love the pre-code films. And he was able to work as a cinematographer for Cecil B. DeMille, F.W. Murnau, and Charlie Chaplin. And we've even seen a few of Karl Struss's films as part of our Cowtown Movie Classics series. Joining us today, we have a very special guest. He is the curator of the Karl Struss exhibit, Mr. Jon Frembling. How are you doing today, Jon?
Doing great. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Jon, what are your day-to-day responsibilities as a curator for the Amon Carter Museum?
Sure. I am fortunate that I get to wear two hats. So I am one of the curatorial staff here at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art. So we, of course, create our exhibitions like the Karl Struss show. But my other hat is I'm also the head of the archives program here. And so we do, of course, our mundane things like take care of our institutional created records. But more excitingly, we get all of the special collection material. So the artist made material like Karl Struss's letters, diaries, scrapbooks, all of his exhibition studies, all sorts of different material that really tell the fuller story about the artist. It's not just a pretty picture. We get to dive into what's going on beyond the picture, that larger context that you get there. And so I have a unique perspective on the staff here, where as the manuscript curator, I get to bring in all of these additional elements into an exhibition to tell that bigger story.
Oh, absolutely. And I know we're very excited about this exhibition in particular. So, how did the Amon Carter come across this vast collection of Karl Struss pieces?
Well, so it's part of our long program here at the museum of working with photographers' legacies. We were fortunate that our first director, way back in 1961, had a vision for the museum to be more than just, a Western art museum. And of course, as a fairly young museum in terms of museums, we also couldn't compete with older institutions on, some of these kinds of the older art forms like painting and sculpture. And so this director said, well, why don't we collect photography? Photography is something that a lot of the bigger museums aren't doing yet. And so we got in essentially on the ground floor. And so we have probably one of the best collections of photography in the nation. And so we've worked with a lot of photographers during their lifetimes and represent their states and have a huge swath of photographs, hundreds of thousands, literally, photographs in the collection. And Karl Struss is one of those artists who is a key player in the early 20th century American art photography. And so, of course, we were naturally interested in all of what he's doing in New York at the turn of the 20th century up through the outbreak of World War One. So, he's really instrumental in that New York art world there at the beginning of the century. And that's what brings us to Karl Struss, at least initially.
And Karl Struss, he's a fascinating figure because, as I said, he worked for so many amazing directors. In the 1930s, he had an incredible career working on such films that we've discussed, like Island of Lost Souls, The Sign of the Cross, of course, the Academy Award winning Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from 1931. But like I said, the goal of our programming is to make classic films accessible to a contemporary audience, but to also reevaluate these films as an art form. And I think a lot of times, people look at movies and television, it's disposable entertainment. And I think now this is as worse of a time as any, as people are used to watching things on their phone, they stream things on the background. People don't really respect the moving image, let's say, as they do still photography or painting. But to me, I think they're all valid art forms. And this is a man, Karl Struss, who dabbled in both worlds. So, what was his background like? How did he get started as a still photographer when that was still a very early art form in the United States?
Sure. I mean, I think this is what makes Struss such a fascinating subject. So he's technically either second or third generation German American, depending on whether you're talking about his father or his mother.
Mm-hmm.
And so his father is from a German immigrant family that comes to the U.S. in the 1850s with the unification of Germany into a kind of a state in the 1860s. And so his father's side of the family comes down through several generations in New York. His father goes back, marries a German national, so his mom's directly German. And so there's part of this immigrant community in New York that's very tight knit. They're successful. They're business people. He has multiple siblings, all very talented, including a brother who's a year and a half or 2 years older than him that he just idolizes. I mean, he just thinks his brother William is just the bee's knees.
Mm-hmm.
And so they do everything together. And so as children, William takes up the camera. And so they go out on family vacations with these early kind of the early versions of like Kodaks and the Pony Primo little cameras and these kinds of things photographed together. Will would help him or have Karl help him develop the photographs, that kind of thing. And so they spend all these summers together doing this. And then I think just as Will turns 20, I want to say, he dies very suddenly of spinal meningitis. And so Karl is devastated. And in some ways, I would argue he takes up the camera and continues his brother's legacy as an homage to this sibling that he admired so much. But to be clear, he also has incredible talent. He's very, very good at what he does. He has this artist's eye and a natural sense of composition and the ability to really innovate in a lot of things, which will play a major role in his later career. And so he takes up the camera. He's still working a full-time job and enrolls at I want to say it's NYU or Columbia,
Mm-hmm.
and takes the film photography studies program there under Clarence White, and really just has a knack for it. Clarence White, one of the big names of early photography or 20th century photography, admires him, kind of promotes him, and then he gets involved with Alfred Stieglitz, the great art impresario in New York. And Stieglitz is really this tastemaker, so he's being taught by the best, Clarence White, and he's being working with the great kind of promoter of photography. Is featured in camera work, the biggest and best of the photo periodicals, and 1912, and then really that kind of launches his career. And from there, he over the next 6 years, he's a successful commercial photographer, art photographer, showing in salons across the globe, not just nationally but internationally, and really is very successful and probably would have stayed there if World War I hadn't broke out. So, of course, the U.S. eventually gets involved, and Struss enlists. He does not wait to be drafted. He enlists because he wants to do his patriotic part, just like his great grandfather had done in the Civil War. He also enlisted to fight for the Union.
Mm-hmm.
Now the problem, though, is that someone within the New York art world starts kind of bad mouthing him, and he never figures out who it is. But there are people that are jealous of this young guy who's barely into his 20s, rising right to the top right away, and they start saying he's got pro-German sympathies because remember, German American, and we're fighting Germany, and so the government is not. They can't really prove anything, but they also are not going to trust him with anything because he had enlisted to be part of the aerial photography program, flying in these early biplanes over the trenches to photograph, get strategic intelligence and this kind of thing. So they didn't want him anywhere near confidential information, but they can't make anything stick, and so they station him at Fort Leavenworth as a guard. So he's stuck there at this military prison, and then with nothing to do. He's not a prisoner, but he's stuck in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, with nothing to do. And so he ultimately decides, I'm going to go into town and start watching these things called the movies. And that really sparks an idea within him that maybe I can try my hand at this other medium. And it really works out because he's good at it and will prove that pretty quickly. And essentially, as soon as he's honorably discharged from the military, he gets on a train and doesn't ever go back to New York. He goes straight to Hollywood from Fort Leavenworth. Just asks his parents to send his stuff to Hollywood, because he essentially just turns his back on New York as they had turned their back on him.
Hmm.
And so that really is what gets him into Hollywood. Is he knows he's good at photography, and he really wants to try this new medium that he's encountered.
Yes, and he certainly put it to good use. Now, I'm glad you actually mentioned his European background because in the 1920s and 30s, Paramount Pictures was famous for recruiting some of the best European talent. Come here, and they brought that more artistic sensibility, that more visual eye. And you look at some of Karl Struss's cinematography, it has very much an expressionistic edge. So when I was discovering his films early on, I just assumed, oh, he was this German guy that came over here, which, as so many of the early filmmakers were, European immigrants. But yeah, I was kind of shocked to learn the man, he was from New York City originally, right? He was born in New York.
Yep.
And he's not unlike, there's another famous director. I don't know if you're familiar with Joseph von Sternberg, of course, who did, the early Marlene Dietrich films. And he's another one where he actually went to Germany to cut his teeth making movies like The Blue Angel in German with stars, with Marlene Dietrich. But I was shocked when I watched an interview with him. And oh, he was speaking perfect English with a Brooklyn accent. Joseph von Sternberg was also born in New York City, but he was able to travel the world. And obviously, both of these men picked up very interesting things and ideas along the way and brought it back to Hollywood.
Yeah, and that really works out for Struss. He does get his break there in Hollywood first with still photography, doing promotional shots and that kind of thing, because he's a photographer.
Mhm.
But pretty quickly they put him behind a motion picture camera because they recognize his eye, and within 6 years of arriving in Hollywood, he's paired with F.W. Murnau. Murnau, of course, this expat, German expressionist, master director.
Yeah.
I do love Nosferatu, for example. They're paired together because, of course, Struss speaks German. They speak German at home, and so it's a not only does he have the talent, but it makes the collaboration with this German director that much easier. And they really create one of the most gorgeous films ever made, and I argue it's still one of the best ever made. Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans. It really is a really fine example of Struss's eye married to Murnau's directorial kind of mastering. And you can see a lot of that expressionism that Murnau uses, for example, in Nosferatu in Sunrise, because you can see kind of the mindset of the characters, for example, and how there's no right angles in their house. It's all these forced perspectives as people go forward and backwards in the plane. You can see the room kind of is at these weird janky angles, and all the furniture is not like built on right angles and this kind of thing, and it kind of conveys the unstableness of the relationship between man and wife, the two unnamed characters who are the central players. And so you can really kind of get that. And then with Struss, you will then see him developing and using some of these techniques that he's known for, both his Struss lighting. He was always very good at lighting, especially actresses. They loved him because he knows how to take a good portrait. And he develops the Lupe light. So it's really kind of fun there. And he also does early work with green screens where he's adding effects after the fact. There's one really wonderful scene in Sunrise where you have the two actors, Janet Gaynor and George O'Brien. They're madly in love. They've just remarried in the church. They've come down the steps, and there's a long, beautiful tracking shot of them just walking down the steps. And then it pans to what they're saying, and they're just in each other's arms and staring at each other. And of course, there's birds and sunshine and kind of all this beautiful stuff. But of course, they're walking into traffic, and it cuts to what the world is saying, and it's all the cars whizzing around them and that kind of thing, honking their horns, and it's like, you idiots, get out of the road. And Struss, of course, adds all those effects, using the green screen, after the fact. And so he's a real technical whiz in a lot of ways, and you can see some of those early techniques in a film like Sunrise.
Yeah, Sunrise is an incredible film. I don't want to say it's ahead of its time, but it certainly pushed the boundaries for what the filmmaking process was capable of in the day. And actually, before Sunrise, he was the director of photography on the original version of Ben-Hur in
Oh yeah.
1925. And again, that's an amazing, I mean, there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen for a big project like that, right? You have a cast of thousands, all these incredible sets. Of course, Fred Niblo was the director on that, but he actually invented a really fascinating technique. So in that movie, there's a famous scene towards the climax of the film where it is the healing of the lepers. So of course, Ben-Hur's mother and sister, they have leprosy, and all in one frame, without cutting away, you see their kind of gaunt, sickly makeup fade away as Christ waves his hand. And this is a technique that Struss would reuse to great effect in 1931 with Ruben Mamoulian's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Yeah, I mean, really great examples, and the long tracking shots. I want to say that Akira Kurosawa cites Struss's long tracking shot at the beginning of Sunrise as inspiration for what he's doing in his films like Seven Samurai or Rashomon or some of these other films where you really see these techniques that are being developed.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and of course, Sunrise came out in 1927. That was right at the transition between the silent era and, of course, Hollywood shifting towards sound. And Sunrise was one of those examples. It's usually cited as this was sort of the peak of visual filmmaking. This is the power, this is the potential the medium had. But then that was sort of cut short once talking pictures came in, because of course the cameras were boxed off, they were locked in. Once talking pictures came in, the sound and the audio became the priority, so you didn't get as much camera movement, at least for the first couple of years. But I think what made Struss brilliant was he was kind of one of the first pioneers after the coming of sound to get the camera moving again.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can see some of the other stuff he's doing in his other films. As technology progresses, both first with sound and then Struss is a leader in color as well. He was the go-to guy for Technicolor at the studios. When the early Technicolor was coming out, they knew they could rely on Struss to understand how it works and film it. And so if you look at a lot of the early Technicolor films, they're all Struss films, and that's for a reason. He was the go-to cinematographer for those films. And then, although it was a little bit of a fad, 3D, same thing. He was very good at working in 3D as well. So yeah, front to
Well,
back, you kind of just innovator on a lot of these things.
yeah, absolutely. And well, and you mentioned Technicolor, Ben-Hur, the 1925 film. There's many sequences which were shot in two color or two strip Technicolor at that time, and I believe a lot of it, unfortunately, it's been lost to history. But in the surviving version, you do get a sense of that and what Struss was able to do with color in that early medium.
Yeah, it's exciting. So.
Yeah. So, what are some of the pieces? What are you most excited about sharing with the public?
Well, so we really wanted to in this particular exhibition, we really wanted to focus on that Hollywood, that Hollywood half of his career. We did an exhibition on Struss back in 1996 that focused on our main wheelhouse, and that's still photography. That New York time with Alfred Stieglitz and the photo secession. And so this one really focuses primarily on Struss, 1919 through 1950. The kind of the golden age of Hollywood. That's was our target. Now, we do provide context to his career in New York. There's a kind of introductory room where we talk about the setup to it. This is where he develops his skills and all that. And then we do a transition almost immediately then into his first films. Oh gosh, male and female. Some of the trying to think of what all are in there. Of course, Ben-Hur is going to be a major part. And basically, what we've done is we tried to storyboard a couple of the films to get a sense of how these silent films work, and specifically how Struss is interacting with them. Because in his early work, before the 1925 Ben-Hur, he's usually doing double duty. He's usually running either the second or third camera. He's usually not the primary cinematographer in these early films. He's doing one of the the subunits. But he also is responsible for doing the publicity stills. And we always like to point out, these are not screen grabs. This is not a frame taken out of the film and used as a promotional thing. A photographer like Struss is usually, as soon as the camera stops rolling, they will reset everything and then they will shoot the actors in the scene in a way that tries to convey what the entire scene is trying to show. And so if there, for example, if there's a cutaway or like in the film where this person is dreaming about this other thing, what Struss will do with this is he films that person looking pensive off into the distance, and he'll add like a, like the little float bubble here with the cutaway that's in the film. And so these are not, they're often not actually even scenes that are in the film. They're a recreation or condensation of what's happening. And so, these early stills are really fascinating for that in that regard. And we have hundreds of them in the collection for these early movies. And so we tried to show how these films, what the plot is, but also how Struss is kind of working with the medium, both still photography and motion picture, to create, a story, essentially. Really fascinating.
Absolutely, and it's fascinating to me that he's taking these distinctly cinematic techniques like optical effects, compositing images, doing things like that, and also applying it to the still photography.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's in the lobby. These are the lobby cards that people are going to see. These have to tell the story. It's got to be enough to go, oh, I want to see that. It has to be engaging, has to be interesting, but you don't want to give away too much either. So, I always hate trailers that tell you the entire plot of the movie. It's like, okay, I don't need to see this.
Of course, but I mean, you just need a really compelling image to kind of suck you in. Like, oh, I want to know what that movie is about.
Yep, exactly. And so we do a lot of that in the films, and really that's the focus all the way up through that 1925 film. And in the exhibition, that's the transition with Ben-HUR, because that's his big break. He's usually doing second camera and all these other things on these other films, and Ben-HUR really is where he comes in and saves this really troubled production. I mean, the thing
Oh,
is
yeah.
shot 3 times.
Right, right.
Hollywood, Rome, and then back to Hollywood. And Struss is really the one who finishes the film. So yeah.
Yeah, and it is an incredible film. If you've never seen the 1925 version, because of course most of us are probably more familiar with the Charlton Heston version from 1959. But even if you're not a silent movie fan, there's a lot to offer in that 1925 film. Just the spectacle, the scope, and of course those groundbreaking special effects.
Yep. And as I understand it, the Charlton Heston version is reusing the kinds of shots that Struss is doing for the 1925 film. Like the chariot race scene is a restructuring or recreation of what Struss is doing earlier. So he doesn't shoot the Heston film, but his hand is on it. And so,
Yeah.
although it's better known, it's a Struss film in many ways.
Yeah, I mean his legacy certainly lived on. It that chariot race in the original one, you see some of those shots and angles. Like he must have put the camera in a ditch to get these like overhead. You see shots of like the chariots racing over the camera. You see shots where the camera has to be mounted to the chariot. It's just as exciting and action packed as anything you would see decades later.
That's wonderful. So that is, the kind of the center part is that 1910 through 1925, kind of arc of him developing as a cinematographer, like he had done in New York with his still photography.
Hmm.
Arrives as an unknown, and with a handful of years rises to become a major player in this. But parallel to this idea that you were talking earlier about, where a lot of people today don't necessarily understand the difference between a contemporary movie and how it's made, and what it meant to be making movies at the beginning of the medium. We wanted to try to provide context to what's happening there, and so we have movie periodicals in the exhibition. We have kind of lobby cards, promotional material that tell the kind of surrounding story of who else is there making these films. And then in the center, there is MGM did a kind of a short that would play between films, that basically just takes you around the MGM studio in 1925. And so what it's doing is it's just showing, here's all the actors of today. Here's the different departments. This is the size of the studio and all this. And I love it because it gives you this really broad spectrum of how the movies are made, who the players are. And then, they get all the people lined up, all the actors and directors and cameramen and this kind of thing. And I love it because when you watch the cameramen, it pans across this whole line of these cameramen all lined up, leaning on their cameras, looking all, like hamming it up for the camera and this kind of thing. But Struss, he's there and he puts his name on the front of the camera. He's always very aware and conscious of his reputation and promoting himself. And so you know exactly which one Karl Struss is as that camera pans across this phalanx of other unnamed professionals. And so it really tries to provide that context to what you're saying. And if I may, I
Please.
will also add that I love that movies today, again, like you were saying, is people just watch them on the phone. It's something you just kind of sit down, watch a portion of, come back to it later or whatever. It was an experience in the early days. I mean, often these early theaters are repurposed vaudeville or kind of playhouses that are repurposed for this new medium. And so we feature one of the playhouses here in the Dallas Fort Worth area, the old Worth Theater, or the New Majestic, sorry, the New Majestic Theater, which started as a vaudeville house and then was converted to movies. And so we have all the placards and kind of promotional material for that. And then we have the playbills for Sunrise, and because you got a program like you were going to a play for these early movies. It tells you who the actors are, what roles they're playing, a synopsis of the plot, the seating chart. It's exactly what you would expect to find if you went to see a play, but it's for a movie because it was still an early medium, and they really were kind of differentiating which was which. And so you get a lot of the kind of material that tells that larger story, which I think is fun.
I'm glad you brought that up. As a matter of fact, so in February, I was fortunate enough to host, or at least introduce, they showed Casablanca, and it happened one night at the Majestic Theater in Dallas, which of course is the companion space to the Fort Worth one, which unfortunately has long since been demolished. But you're sitting there watching it on this incredible, this massive screen, and I'm just sitting there and I'm watching the movie, but then I'm looking at the architecture, I'm looking at the molding, the details, and it really does take you into another time period. It really does lift you into another era to the point where you start thinking, like, you know what, 90 years ago, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, this is how in the bigger cities like Dallas, New York, Chicago, this is the type of experience those urban audiences would get to see these films in. You're looking at this massive screen. This is like the IMAX of the day. It's like IMAX meets Broadway. And I think that's like the closest thing we can compare it to nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it was an experience, and we're
Yeah,
really trying to convey that within the exhibition. And so, after that, after the early starting point, he establishes his bona fides. He's paired with Murnau. We'll be filming or screening the entirety of Sunrise in the exhibition on a loop. So, depending on when you come in, you can see the entire film. It doesn't have time for it to show 4 times throughout the day. It'll be in its entirety. We'll have stills and various, kind of, behind the scenes shots in the gallery along with it. We're going to we have the Oscar. So he wins, of course, the first Academy Award ever given for cinematography for Sunrise. And so it'll be in the exhibition. So if you want to see that very first Oscar, it'll be there. And then after that, it moves into the final kind of space, and that is the post Sunrise career. He ultimately has a 50-year career in Hollywood, but we cut it off at 1950 as kind of an arbitrary stopping point.
sure.
But this is where he's moving into the Charlie Chaplin films. Mary Pickford, he does a fair number of films with her. He does the kind of 30s films that he's nominated 3 more times for: Sign of the Cross, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Aloma of the South Seas. And so each of those he's nominated for a different reason, but every time it always focusing on his mastery of medium and his ability to technically innovate. It's like the Dr. and Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's that transition effect. The ability to convey the psychological horror of the rational man devolving into this bestial kind of almost simian-like kind of creature, all in a single shot. Those transition effects are just gorgeous. Sign of the Cross, of course, uses all these really great kind of overlays, and it's another sword and sandal epic like the Ben-Hur was. And then Aloma of the South Seas it's a Technicolor film. It's an early Technicolor film that Struss really gets involved in. I would say, arguably, the plot is a little silly. It's an unnamed Polynesian, kind of South Pacific island kingdom.
Sure.
The prince goes to America to get his education, comes back to find he's been replaced by a cousin who's also trying to kidnap his love, and so he's got to defeat his bad sibling or relative, win the girl, and save his island kingdom, all while there's a volcano erupting and some all sorts of just silliness. But it's in Technicolor. It's not necessarily the plot that's amazing. It's what Struss is doing with the plot. And that really is kind of, you see what he's getting into as we close out what we're doing. He does a great Dictator with Chaplin. He does a couple more things, and really, Limelight is a great kind of conclusion, and what we end with, and that's that once only pairing of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Karl Struss. These kind of pillars of the early silent era, all together in a film for the only time in their careers. And again, it's a little saccharine, I would argue, but Limelight's a great film because it brings these talents together for once and once only. And that closes out with the final element being the Academy of Motion Pictures did a film series in 1950 and 51 about the different roles within the movie industry. And of course, they naturally choose Karl Struss to be the every cinematographer. So he is the cinematographer in this film series that has a professional in that role talk about what they do. They film him as he wanders around doing his job, and so that's the final element, is really Struss talking about being a cinematographer firsthand, which is really cool.
Yeah. And as you know, working in the museum, the business, the industry, unfortunately, so many great artists, they're not appreciated until after they're gone. But what seems wonderful about Struss is that he got to experience some of those accolades while he was still alive.
He did, but he was also someone who was really conscious of his reputation. It's something that comes out in his biography, and it comes up a little in the exhibition, and that's because he had that brush with the government, and accusations of high treason, and he was always a little self-conscious about his role, and because he had also had such success both in New York and then in Hollywood, he was somewhat a little prickly about that reputation element. And so he helped, but that also leads him to professionalize each of those positions. Really, before Stieglitz and Struss are there in New York, you had a lot of professional photographers. Photography was a fine art form, but it really didn't achieve the level of respect that it enjoys today. Stieglitz and Struss are the ones who do that in New York. And then he does these exact same thing in Hollywood. He helps, he's a founding member of the Academy that it really is pushing to professionalize this. Before this, very amateur kind of thing. You had just kind of people show up, you bubble gum and masking tape, and you were good, and now you have roles, you have unions, you have these different things that have to happen, and there's ways that they must be done. And Struss is part of that professionalization of the of Hollywood and the movie making process.
When does the exhibition open, and when can your audience get a chance to see these images firsthand?
Well, so it opens to our members on May 9, and then it opens to the general public on May 12th. And since it is my exhibition, if you recognize me and you see me, I'm happy to talk shop. So come on by. I will happily do walking tours and the like if I'm out and about. And otherwise, it's a show that should be running for about 4 months. And it has a range of different material, as I said. So it's both still photography, movie clips. We have clips from all of the main films that he does. Sunrise being screened in its entirety. It really should be a broad spectrum material and hopefully quite engaging.
Oh, absolutely. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything else you'd like the audience to know about the exhibit?
Come see it.
Right. Jon Frembling, thank you so much for your time.
Most welcome.
All right, I know I'm certainly looking forward to it. Once again, my name is Ryan Bijan. Hope to see you at the exhibit. We'll see you next time.